In the summer of 1986, a respected forest ranger vanished without a trace while patrolling a remote Montana campground. For 18 years, his disappearance remained one of the park's deepest mysteries, until a group of campers unearthed a rusted ammo box beneath an old fire pit, and what lay inside finally revealed the chilling truth. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall pines, casting long ribbons of light across the remote campsite. A group of friends from Spokane had arrived early, eager to claim a fire pit before nightfall. The air was crisp with the faint scent of pine resin and wood smoke left behind by other campers, and the only sounds were the distant rush of a creek and the occasional call of a raven. While two of them pitched tents, Mark and Leah crouched over the old stone fire ring, brushing away a layer of damp ash and charred wood. The pit looked like it had not been used in years. Beneath the blackened debris, Mark's shovel struck something solid with a dull, metallic clunk. At first, he thought it was just a flat rock, but when he scraped away more ash, the edge of a corroded metal box emerged. It was small, rectangular, and sealed shut with a thick layer of rust. The olive-green paint, though faded and chipped, was still visible beneath the corrosion. Leah brushed away more dirt and ash, revealing faint, stenciled lettering on the lid that was almost unreadable. The box was heavy when Mark lifted it free, as if whatever was inside had been waiting a very long time. "This doesn't look like it belongs here," Leah murmured, her brow furrowing. She ran her fingers along the cold metal, noting deep scratches across the surface. The lock was missing, but the lid would not budge. Mark set it on a nearby picnic table and tried prying it open with a tent stake, but the seal held firm. As they worked, one of their friends wandered over and stopped short. "That looks like an ammo box," he said. "Like the kind my grandfather had from Vietnam. What's it doing buried under a fire pit?" A strange unease settled over the group. The forest around them, so inviting a few moments ago, now felt watchful, the air heavier. After a quiet debate, they decided to take it to the ranger station just down the main trail. The walk through the fading light was tense, none of them speaking much. When they reached the station and set the box on the counter, the young seasonal ranger on duty took one look at it, then at them. His expression shifted from curiosity to something far more serious. "I think you'd better wait here," he said, picking up the phone. "I need to call this in." Detective Lila Carver was halfway through writing up an unrelated case report when the call came in from the state park. The ranger on the other end spoke quickly, his voice tinged with an urgency that cut through the static on the line. Campers had found something buried under an old fire pit, an ammo box. Inside, there were items that looked official, possibly belonging to a park ranger who went missing years ago. Within an hour, Carver's unmarked SUV was winding its way along the narrow, pine-lined road into the park. Evening shadows stretched across the gravel as she pulled into the ranger station lot where the young seasonal ranger met her at the door. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and his expression carried the strained composure of someone trying not to think too hard about what they had just seen. "It's in the back," he said, leading her down a short hallway that smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee. On a metal table sat the ammo box, its olive paint chipped and its hinges stiff with rust. Beside it, a pair of gloves and a sealed evidence bag waited. Carver put on the gloves before touching it. The weight surprised her, heavy for its size, as though it held more than just a few trinkets. She ran her fingers along the pitted surface, noting the faint, almost ghostly outline of military lettering. The metal was cold even in the heated room. "How was it found?" she asked, without looking up. The ranger explained how the campers had been cleaning the fire pit and struck metal beneath the ashes. The pit itself was in an unused section of the campground, one that had not been serviced in years. He paused before adding, "That whole area has a strange history. People say it's cursed. No one camps there anymore." Carver eased the corroded latch open with a careful twist, the sound of metal scraping metal echoing in the small room. The lid lifted with a reluctant groan. Inside, wrapped in a stiff, stained cloth, lay a park ranger badge dulled with age, a wristwatch frozen at 2, 17, and a faded flannel shirt crusted with dark stains. Beneath them, sealed in a plastic sleeve, was a small, water-damaged notebook. The air seemed to thicken around them. Carver looked at the ranger, her voice low. Who was the last ranger to patrol that part of the park? His answer came without hesitation. Daniel Whitmore. He disappeared in 1986. The name hit Carver like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples through a part of her memory she had not visited in years. Daniel Whitmore's disappearance had been a ghost story in law enforcement circles, the kind of case rookies whispered about during late-night shifts. A decorated Army veteran turned forest ranger, he had been known for his calm demeanor and encyclopedic knowledge of the park. In June of 1986, he had radioed in about investigating suspicious activity near the North Ridge campground. Minutes later, the transmission dissolved into static. He was never heard from again. Carver sat at the metal table, the low hum of the overhead lights filling the silence. She reached for the notebook, its pages swollen and brittle from years of moisture. The ink had blurred into dark veins across the paper, but some of the writing remained legible. She flipped carefully to the first intact page. Patrol log, June 11, 1986. Noted unregistered tent at North Ridge. No permit on file. Male occupant avoided contact. Will follow up. The next page was dated June 12. Heard movement near fire tower after midnight. Found boot prints in soft soil. Not park issue. Carver's eyes traced the words slowly, aware that she was reading the thoughts of a man in his final days. The last clear entry was short, almost hurried. If I do not make it back, check the tower. R.L. knows. She set the notebook down, the letters R.L. burning into her thoughts. The ranger across from her shifted uneasily. Back when it happened, they searched for weeks. Dogs, helicopters, the whole thing. Not a trace. Some said he got lost, but Whitmore didn't get lost, not in his own park. Carver studied the badge lying on the cloth. Its number matched the records. She imagined Whitmore clipping it to his shirt that morning, stepping out into the cool mountain air, unaware he was walking into the final hours of his life. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a low sigh. She felt the weight of the years pressing in, the gap between the man's last words and this moment closing in an instant. 18 years of silence, and now a box of belongings had surfaced from under a forgotten fire pit. Carver knew one thing with certainty. This was no random find. Someone had placed that box there for a reason, and whoever R.L. was, they might still be alive. By the time Carver stepped back outside, the last streaks of daylight were draining from the sky, leaving the forest in muted shades of blue and gray. The campers who had made the discovery were waiting near the station's porch, their faces pale and restless under the dim yellow light. They had given statements, but it was clear they were eager to put distance between themselves and what they had found. She spoke to them briefly, confirming the location of the fire pit and the exact sequence of events. Their voices lowered when they described the moment the shovel struck metal, as if speaking louder might invite something unwelcome back from the trees. One of them mentioned a faint smell when the box was first pried loose, not of rot, but of something metallic and old, like pennies and smoke. Carver noted the detail and sent them on their way. She had already arranged for a team to secure the campsite through the night. If that pit had been used to hide one thing, there could be more. Back inside the station, she spread a faded topographical map across the counter. The North Ridge campground was marked in pale green, a cluster of small sites tucked between the base of the ridge and the creek. From there, an old trail wound up to the disused fire tower. She traced the route with her finger, stopping at a contour line where the terrain steepened. The ranger leaned over the map, pointing to a spot just west of the tower. That's where they found those boot prints in '86, same area Whitmore wrote about in the report. It was muddy that year, easy to track someone if they didn't cover their trail. But the rain came in hard the next day, wiped everything clean. Carver folded the map slowly, her mind assembling pieces that had been scattered for nearly 2 decades. A hidden box, a warning in a notebook, initials that meant nothing yet but carried weight. She thought about the kind of person who could erase a man like Daniel Whitmore from the face of the earth and then walk away without leaving a trace. Somewhere out in that forest, buried beneath years of quiet, the truth was waiting. The box had surfaced. Sooner or later, the rest of it would too. The following morning broke clear and cold, the kind of mountain air that carried every sound like a whisper through the trees. Carver stood at the edge of the North Ridge campground, the damp scent of earth and pine needles mixing in the early light. The site where the ammo box had been unearthed was now ringed with yellow tape, the blackened stones of the fire pit casting long shadows across the ash-strewn ground. A forensic team worked quietly, sifting through the soil with fine mesh screens. Each scrape of a trowel revealed bits of charcoal, rusted nails, and small shards of glass. Nothing yet that carried the weight of the box, but Carver knew not to dismiss the smallest fragment. She crouched beside the pit, her gloved hands brushing away a thin layer of soot. The ground beneath was compacted, almost unnaturally so, as if it had been tamped down deliberately. 18 years was a long time, but the way soil settled told its own story. Someone had chosen this spot carefully. The lead forensic tech glanced up. Box was buried about a foot down, not deep enough for long-term concealment, which is strange. Whoever did this either wanted it to be found eventually, or they were in a hurry. Carver looked past the campsite toward the narrow trail that vanished into the thick undergrowth. She could picture Whitmore here in the summer of 1986, making his rounds, noting things others might overlook. The sound of a misplaced bootstep, a flicker of movement through the trees. The ranger from the station arrived with a thermos of coffee, his expression drawn. "I checked the old duty rosters," he said. The night Whitmore disappeared, only 2 other rangers were on shift. One retired and moved south. The other, he died in a hunting accident in the 90s. Carver sipped the coffee, her gaze never leaving the trail. "And the initials RL mean nothing to you?" He shook his head. "Not to me. But if Whitmore wrote them down, it mattered." She set the cup aside, her decision already made. The fire pit had given up its first secret. The next step was the fire tower, the place Whitmore himself had pointed to in his final words. If the past was going to speak, that was where she would hear it. The trail to the old fire tower climbed steadily, winding through dense stands of lodgepole pine and spruce. Carver moved at a measured pace, her boots crunching over frost-hardened soil, the sound of her breathing mingling with the faint rustle of branches overhead. The morning sun was slow to reach this part of the forest, leaving pockets of shadow that seemed to cling stubbornly to the ground. The ranger accompanied her, carrying a set of bolt cutters in case the tower had been sealed. They spoke little, their attention on the path ahead. Here and there, the remnants of old trail markers clung to tree trunks, their paint flaking away in long strips. It had been years since anyone maintained this route, but the path itself still bore the subtle depressions of countless footsteps from decades past. When they reached the clearing, the tower rose before them like a skeleton of weathered steel, its once bright paint faded to a dull mottled gray. The wooden steps leading up creaked under the ranger's weight as he tested the first few, but they held. Carver followed, her hand sliding along the cold metal railing, eyes scanning the surrounding tree line. From this height, the park stretched in all directions, a patchwork of ridges and valleys. The interior of the observation room was stripped bare, the windows clouded with grime. Dust motes drifted in the beams of sunlight cutting through the glass. In one corner, nailed to the wall, was a photograph curled at the edges. Carver stepped closer. It was a faded image of a young woman with long hair, smiling stiffly at the camera. The backdrop suggested a roadside diner, but there was no date, no name. The ranger frowned. "That's been here a long time, at least since I started in '99. We all assumed it was just something a bored lookout tacked up." Carver studied the photograph, the woman's eyes sharp despite the fading. It was out of place, too deliberate to be decoration. She slipped on gloves and eased it from the wall. On the back, written in smudged pencil, was a single line, North Trail, Mile 6. A prickle of unease crawled up her spine. Whitmore had warned someone to check the tower. Now it was giving her another direction entirely. Whatever happened in 1986, it was leading her deeper into the forest. The wind had picked up by the time Carver descended from the tower, rattling the branches overhead and sending dry needles skittering across the ground. She slipped the photograph into an evidence sleeve, the image of the young woman still lingering in her mind. The penciled words on the back were faint but clear enough to follow. North Trail, Mile 6. The ranger glanced toward the path that led deeper into the forest. "That's a rough stretch," he said. "Overgrown, rocky in places. We haven't maintained it in years." Carver tightened the strap of her pack. "Then we go careful." The trail narrowed quickly, forcing them to walk single file. Fallen branches crisscrossed the ground, and thick ferns brushed against Carver's legs as she moved. The forest here felt different, heavier somehow, as if it held on to the memory of what had happened. Every few minutes, she caught herself scanning the shadows between the trees, searching for movement that never came. At just over 5 miles in, the ranger slowed and pointed to a section where the trail widened briefly before bending out of sight. "This is where we start losing the markers. Past here, it's easy to get turned around." Carver crouched near a rotting log, her eyes catching on something pale beneath a layer of leaf litter. She brushed the debris aside to reveal a length of frayed rope, its fibers stiff with age. The knot at one end was still intact, pulled tight as if it had been under strain. They pressed on until her GPS indicated they were nearing Mile 6. The trail here was barely more than a game path, hemmed in by underbrush. A clearing opened suddenly on the right, the ground flat and littered with old campfire stones. In the center was a shallow depression, as if something large had once rested there. Carver stepped into the clearing, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. She crouched, running her hand over the ground, noting the unnatural uniformity of the soil. The ranger stood at the edge, watching her carefully. "This place doesn't show on the old maps," he said quietly. Carver looked back toward the trail. The photograph in her pack seemed heavier now, its message more pointed. Whitmore had left clues, and she was beginning to think he knew exactly what would be found here. Carver knelt in the center of the clearing, the cool earth pressing against her knees as she examined the shallow depression. The soil was loose and darker than the surrounding ground, and when she pushed her gloved fingers into it, she found it gave way too easily for something untouched in nearly 2 decades. She could smell it, too, that faint metallic tang she associated with old tools and rusted nails. The ranger hovered a few steps back, scanning the perimeter as if expecting someone to step out from between the trees. "This isn't a normal campsite," he said. "No ring of stones, no sign of a tent platform. It's like whoever was here didn't want to leave a trace." Carver straightened and motioned for the small evidence kit she had brought in her pack. Using a trowel, she began to scrape the top layer away, revealing bits of charred wood and something more stubborn beneath. A flash of dull green caught her eye. She brushed away more soil, her heart rate ticking up. It was canvas, coarse and stiff, the edge frayed but still strong enough to hold shape. She worked carefully, exposing more of it until the outline suggested a folded tarp buried deliberately. The ranger crouched beside her now, his voice low. Could be old gear, or something wrapped inside. The tarp was too embedded to pull out without damaging it, and Carver knew the right move was to stop before contaminating the scene. She sat back on her heels, staring at it, the weight of possibility settling over her. This could be nothing more than discarded supplies. Or it could be what Whitmore had died trying to reveal. A sudden gust rattled the treetops, scattering a flurry of brittle leaves across the clearing. Carver glanced around, acutely aware of the silence that followed. She could feel the history here, as if the ground itself remembered the struggle, the fear, the moment it swallowed whatever had been left behind. She marked the coordinates on her GPS and took a series of photographs from multiple angles. "We'll need a full excavation team," she said finally. "This isn't something we touch on our own." The ranger gave a short nod. though his eyes lingered on the half-buried tarp. Neither of them said it out loud, but they both knew. Whatever was under this soil had been waiting 18 years to be found. By the time Carver and the ranger made it back to the station, the light had shifted into the flat gray of late afternoon. The photograph from the fire tower and the coordinates of the tarp site sat in her notebook like pieces of a puzzle she could almost see but not yet solve. She placed a call to the regional field office, requesting an excavation team for first light. The request was met with a pause, then a measured acknowledgement that told her they understood the urgency without her having to say more. While she waited for confirmation, Carver asked the ranger for access to any archival material on Whitmore's disappearance. He returned with a dusty cardboard box from the storage room, the edges worn soft with age. Inside were brittle manila folders, a handful of Polaroids, and the official incident report typed on yellowing paper. The photographs showed Whitmore in his uniform, smiling against the backdrop of the park's sweeping valleys. Another image, taken during the original search, showed a group of volunteers combing a meadow with their eyes downcast, unaware of the camera. Carver studied the faces, searching for anything out of place, but found nothing. The incident report was straightforward. Last contact with Whitmore at 9:42 p.m., June 12, 1986. Search initiated at 10:15 p.m. Weather conditions: light rain, increasing overnight. Areas searched: North Ridge Campground, Fire Tower, trails leading east and west. Outcome: no sign of subject, case left open. It was the supplemental notes at the back that caught her attention. One line, in the clipped handwriting of the lead investigator at the time, read, "Unconfirmed report of poacher camp near Mile 6 North Trail, no evidence found." Carver closed the folder slowly, the connection snapping into place. Whitmore's last entry mentioned RL, and here was a note about poachers, the kind of people a ranger might have confronted. The initials could match a name. She jotted it down, her mind already sifting through possibilities. Outside, the wind pressed against the station's windows, carrying with it the creak of branches. 18 years ago, Whitmore had walked into that forest and never walked out. Now, with each step she took into his trail, the shape of what happened was beginning to emerge, faint but undeniable. The tarp at Mile 6 would not stay buried much longer. Morning came cold and brittle, the kind of chill that clung to the skin and made breath hang in the air. Carver stood at the edge of the clearing at Mile 6, watching as the excavation team unloaded their gear. Shovels, trowels, screens, and evidence bags were laid out in a careful line. The forest around them was quiet except for the occasional knock of a woodpecker somewhere high in the pines. The tarp was exactly as she had left it, its dull green edges barely visible beneath the dark soil. The lead tech knelt beside it, slipping on gloves before testing the ground with a narrow probe. After a few moments, he nodded to his team and began the slow process of peeling away the top layer of earth. As the soil came away, the tarp emerged in fuller view, its folds packed with years of dirt and decay. The smell rose gradually, faint at first and then sharper, an acrid blend of rot and rust. Carver stepped closer, her jaw tightening. She had been in this position before, standing over something that had been hidden for decades, knowing it was about to tell its story. The techs worked with deliberate care, freeing one corner and then another, until the contents began to take shape. Inside was a bundle, the outer layer of canvas, stiff with age. When they cut it open, the first thing visible was a cracked leather belt with a tarnished brass buckle. Beside it lay a pair of heavy boots, the soles worn smooth, their laces knotted tight. The final layer revealed what Carver had both expected and dreaded. Human remains, long reduced to bone, lay wrapped in the remnants of a park ranger's uniform. The badge was missing, but the name patch was still faintly visible, the stitched letters dulled but unmistakable. Whitmore. The ranger, standing a few feet away, removed his hat, bowing his head. No one spoke for a long moment, the only sound the whisper of wind through the clearing. Carver took a step back, feeling the gravity of the years collapse into this single point in time. Daniel Whitmore had been found. But the forest had not yet given up the name of the person who put him here, and Carver intended to take that answer from it. The remains were transferred to the state crime lab by late afternoon, the convoy of vehicles moving slowly down the park's winding road. Carver stayed behind in the clearing, the smell of disturbed earth still clinging to the cold air. She walked the perimeter alone, scanning for anything the excavation might have missed. A place like this had a way of holding secrets in plain sight. Near the far edge of the clearing, where the undergrowth thickened, something pale caught her attention. She crouched, parting the ferns to reveal a scrap of fabric tangled in the roots. It was a fragment of flannel, its pattern faded but still visible, streaked with a dark stain that had long since dried. She slipped it into an evidence bag, the thought of Whitmore's journal entry about suspicious activity near the tower stirring in her mind. Back at the station, the ranger was waiting with a folder of visitor records from 1986. They were incomplete, handwritten in places, and smudged from years of handling, but the names were there. Carver flipped through them slowly until she found one that made her pause. Roy Latham. The initials RL. The entry was brief, noting a 2-day permit for the North Ridge campground in early June. There was no record of him checking out. "Who is he?" she asked. The ranger rubbed his jaw. Back then, he was known as a trapper, worked the edges of the park, not exactly legal. People said he was tough to deal with, kept to himself. Haven't heard his name in years. Carver closed the folder, the name fixed firmly in her thoughts. She knew that if Latham was still alive, he was now in his late 70s, maybe older. Time might have loosened his grip on the past, or it might have hardened it into something unshakable. That night, she sat in the quiet of the ranger station, the sounds of the forest seeping in through the thin walls. Somewhere in these trees, Daniel Whitmore had crossed paths with Roy Latham. One had never walked back out, and the other had carried that knowledge for nearly 2 decades. Carver intended to make sure that silence ended. Carver found Roy Latham's address in an old property registry, a remote parcel of land tucked against the park's western boundary. The file noted a single cabin, no utility hookups, and a rough access road that often washed out in spring. It was the kind of place someone could disappear into without much effort. She set out early, the road narrowing until it was little more than 2 ruts carved through brush and stone. The trees grew denser here, their limbs knitting overhead to block much of the morning light. When she finally spotted the cabin, it looked as though it had been dropped into the forest decades ago and left to weather on its own. The siding was gray and splintered, the windows clouded with grime, and a stack of split logs leaned against the porch. Latham was outside, sharpening an axe on a low stump. He looked up when she pulled in, his eyes narrowing under the brim of a battered hat. Deep lines scored his face, the kind carved by years of sun, wind, and suspicion. "You lost?" His voice was rough, carrying no welcome. Carver stepped out, her badge visible on her jacket. "Roy Latham?" He set the axe aside but did not step forward. "Depends who's asking. I'm investigating a case from 1986, a forest ranger named Daniel Whitmore." At the mention of the name, Latham's gaze flickered, just for an instant, before settling back into a flat stare. "That was a long time ago. I don't know anything about it." Carver studied him, noting the way his shoulders stiffened. "You camped at the North Ridge that June. 2 days according to park records. That's the same week Whitmore disappeared." Latham's mouth tightened. "You can't trust old records. People wrote down whatever they felt like back then." She let the silence stretch, the distant sound of wind moving through the trees filling the space between them. "We found his remains yesterday," she said finally. "Near Mile 6 on the North Trail. And we found other things too, things that suggest he was in trouble before he died." For a moment, something unsettled moved in Latham's eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He turned back toward the stump, picking up the axe again. "You're wasting your time," he said, his voice low. Carver knew better. She had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who had just heard the past, knocking on their door. The conversation with Latham had ended in a slow retreat, his back turning toward her as if closing a door she was not invited to open. Carver left the cabin without forcing it, knowing too much pressure too soon would send a man like him deeper into silence. She drove away on the rutted road, the forest closing in on both sides, her mind replaying the flicker in his eyes when Whitmore's name was spoken. Back at the ranger station, the forensic report on the remains was waiting. The medical examiner's notes were concise but grim. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Fractures in the forearms consistent with defensive wounds. The uniform was intact except for the missing badge, but the boots were laced tight, suggesting Whitmore had not been caught sleeping or off guard. He had been working, fully dressed, when someone attacked him. The canvas tarp told its own story. Trace evidence of animal hair, likely from a trapped pelt, was embedded in the fibers, along with small flecks of lead that matched old hunting ammunition. Carver read the list twice, her focus locking on the animal hair. Latham had been a trapper. Whitmore's last note spoke of suspicious activity. The overlap was too sharp to ignore. She spread the evidence photos across the table, lining them up in the order they had been recovered. Badge from the ammo box, rope fragment from the trail, flannel scrap near the clearing. The image from the fire tower, the young woman's cautious smile framed against the backdrop of a roadside diner, the words on the back still pulled at her. North Trail, Mile 6. The woman in the photograph was still unidentified. Carver had sent copies to missing persons units in 3 states, but no matches had come through yet. She kept glancing at the photo, wondering if Whitmore had taken it himself or if it had been left in the tower by someone else. Outside, the light was fading again, that quick mountain shift from afternoon to dusk. Carver leaned back in her chair, the map of the North Trail spread open beside her. Latham was lying, or at the very least, hiding something. The problem was that in a place this isolated, hiding had always been easy. She intended to make it impossible. The next morning, Carver drove into the nearest town, a small cluster of weathered buildings clinging to the highway. The diner on the corner was nearly empty, the smell of coffee and frying bacon curling through the air. She had brought the photograph from the fire tower, tucked in a protective sleeve, and she slid it across the counter to the woman pouring her coffee. "Ever seen her before?" Carver asked. The waitress leaned in, squinting at the faded image. For a moment her expression was blank, then a slow flicker of recognition crossed her face. Well, I can't be sure, but she looks like a girl who came through here years back, quiet, kept her eyes down, sat right there at the end booth for almost an hour, nursing a coffee like she was waiting for someone. When was this?" The woman shook her head, thinking. "Had to be mid-80s. Summer, I think. She was with a man, older than her by a good bit, rough-looking. Didn't talk much, just paid in cash and left. I remember because his hands were filthy, like he'd been working in the dirt." Carver's pen stilled on her notepad. "Would you recognize the man if you saw him again?" "I think so. He had this way of looking at you, like he was sizing you up without saying a word. Made the hair on my neck stand up." Carver slid another photo across the counter, a recent one of Roy Latham taken quietly at his cabin. The waitress studied it for only a second before nodding. "That's him, just younger then." The bell over the door jingled as a customer walked in, breaking the moment. Carver gathered the photos, her mind clicking through the implications. The woman in the photograph had been alive in 1986 and had been with Latham, possibly near the time Whitmore vanished. Back in her vehicle, she sat for a long moment, watching the highway traffic drift past. If Latham had been with her, and Whitmore had known about it, the confrontation that ended in violence might not have been about poaching alone. The girl was part of it. And somewhere, the reason Whitmore died was tied to her. Carver turned the key in the ignition, the path ahead narrowing into focus. Carver drove straight from the diner to the county records office, a low brick building that smelled faintly of dust and floor polish. Inside, the clerk led her to a back room where shelves bowed under the weight of old files and ledgers. She asked for any police reports from the mid-'80s involving a young woman matching the photograph's description. The search took nearly an hour, the hum of the fluorescent lights filling the space as folders were opened and closed. When the clerk finally returned, he carried a thin file bound with brittle twine. "This is the only one that comes close," he said, handing it over. Carver untied the string and began reading. The report was dated August 1985. A hitchhiker identified only as Jane Doe had been found walking along the highway 20 miles east of the park. She refused to give her name, appeared malnourished, and had bruising on her wrists. She was taken to a local shelter but left the next day without a trace. The officer's notes mentioned that a man in a green pickup had been seen watching from across the street, but by the time they checked, the truck was gone. Carver stared at the details, her mind mapping them against what she knew. The girl in the photograph could have been this Jane Doe. The timeline fit. If she left the shelter and ended up with Latham, whatever happened next might have drawn Whitmore into the crosshairs. She photocopied the file and stepped back into the late morning sunlight. The air smelled faintly of rain, and clouds were gathering over the ridge. Driving back toward the park, she felt the weight of the connection tightening. Whitmore's last entry had not just been about illegal trapping. He had been tracking something far more dangerous. At the station, she pinned the photograph, the Jane Doe report, and Latham's camping record to the corkboard, the pieces now touching in a way they hadn't before. The ranger watched from the doorway, his brow furrowed. "You think she's the reason Whitmore went out there?" he asked. Carver nodded slowly. "I think she's the reason he never came back." The rain began to patter against the station windows, soft at first, then steady, as if the forest was quietly agreeing with her. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm by the time Carver set out again, the park road slick and glistening under her tires. She drove with the wipers sweeping slow arcs across the windshield, her thoughts looping around the same image. Whitmore, alone on that trail in the summer of 1986, following the faint signs of a girl who did not belong there. Somewhere along the way, Latham had stepped into his path. She turned off onto the narrow track that led toward Latham's cabin, parking just far enough back that her vehicle would not be visible from the clearing. The rain masked her approach, the steady hiss blending with the rustle of wet branches. From the tree line she watched. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a lantern glowed faintly in the window. Latham was home. For nearly half an hour she remained still, observing the rhythm of the place. At one point, the door opened, and he stepped out onto the porch, pulling on a raincoat before heading toward a shed at the edge of the property. When he returned, he carried a canvas bag, the weight of it evident in the way his arm pulled low. Carver's pulse quickened. The bag was old but sturdy, the kind a man might use for tools or supplies, or for something he didn't want others to see. He set it just inside the door, then disappeared into the back of the cabin. She withdrew quietly, the urge to move in tempered by the lack of a warrant. Anything she did now had to be clean, unassailable. She would not give him the chance to slip through on a technicality. Back at the station, she drafted the request for a search, laying out the chain of evidence. The discovery of Whitmore's remains, the photograph placing Latham with an unidentified woman, the Jane Doe file, and Latham's documented presence at the Northridge campground in the days before the disappearance. As she finished, the ranger leaned against the doorway. "You think he knows you're closing in?" Carver capped her pen. "If he doesn't yet, he will soon." The rain deepened outside, the forest settling into a low, constant murmur. Somewhere in that cabin, Latham was sitting with the weight of a story he had kept buried for 18 years. She was done waiting for him to decide to tell it. The search warrant came through just after dawn, the judge's signature still wet on the paper when Carver and 2 deputies rolled out toward Latham's property. The early light was muted by a veil of fog, the forest holding its breath as the vehicles climbed the narrow track. When they reached the clearing, Latham was already on the porch, a cigarette burning between his fingers. He watched them approach without a word, the smoke curling lazily into the cold air. Carver stepped out first, the folded warrant in her hand. "Roy Latham, "We have a lawful order to search your property in connection with the death of Daniel Whitmore." His eyes flicked to the paper, then back to her face. "You think I killed your ranger?" "I think you know exactly what happened to him," she replied. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. The deputies began working methodically, opening cupboards, checking under floorboards, photographing everything. Carver moved toward the corner where she had seen him set the canvas bag the day before. It was there still, leaning against the wall. She crouched, unzipped it, and found a tangle of old traps, a small hatchet, and a coil of rope, so frayed it seemed ready to crumble. In the back room, one deputy called out. Carver followed the voice to find a narrow chest pushed against the wall. When the lid creaked open, the air inside was stale and heavy. Neatly stacked at the bottom were a series of Polaroids, each wrapped in brittle plastic. She lifted one free, and the breath caught in her throat. It was the same young woman from the fire tower photograph, her expression guarded, her wrists marked with faint bruises. There were others. Some showed her standing near a tent in a forest clearing. Others captured her beside Latham, his hand resting on her shoulder. The dates scrawled in the white margins ran through the summer of 1986. Carver slid the photographs into an evidence bag, her voice steady when she turned to the deputy. "Get these to the station, all of them." Latham had moved to the doorway. His cigarette nearly burned to the filter. He looked at her with something between defiance and resignation. "You're stirring up old ground," he said. Carver met his gaze. "That's the idea." Back at the station, Carver spread the Polaroids across the evidence table, each one a fragment of a story that had been buried almost as deeply as Whitmore himself. The young woman's eyes were the constant thread. In some photos they were downcast, in others fixed on the camera, but never once did they look free. The last few in the stack were different. The trees behind her were darker, denser, and in one image, a faint structure could be seen in the background. It was not a cabin, but something more rudimentary, like a hunting blind or a shack built from scavenged wood. She pulled a topographic map from the wall and began marking potential locations where such a structure could exist in 1986. The ranger joined her, scanning the photos. "That one," he said, pointing to the faint shack. "Looks like the old trapping shed near Granite Creek. It's been abandoned for decades." Carver traced the path from mile 6 to Granite Creek. It was a hike that would have taken Whitmore straight through Latham's known trapping grounds. If the girl had been there, Whitmore would have seen her. And if Whitmore had tried to intervene, the confrontation could have turned violent. She called the lab for an update on the remains. The tech's voice on the other end was brisk but measured. "We ran a preliminary on the hair fibers from the tarp. 2 sources. One matches known local wildlife, the other is human." "Female?" Carver asked. "Likely. We'll confirm with DNA, but it's consistent with that." She hung up slowly, her eyes moving back to the Polaroid of the girl standing near the shack. If that hair was hers, it meant she had been in direct proximity to where Whitmore's body ended up. Whether she had witnessed his death or been part of the events that led to it, she was central to the truth. The rain from the previous day had left the park washed clean, the air sharp with pine and cold earth. Carver packed her gear, her decision already made. She would head toward Granite Creek at first light, following the path Whitmore had likely taken 18 years ago. Somewhere along that route, the forest still held the rest of the story, and she intended to walk straight into it. The morning broke cold and bright, the kind of sharp light that made the forest seem both beautiful and untrustworthy. Carver set out on the trail to Granite Creek with the ranger at her side, their boots crunching over frost-hardened soil. The path wound through stands of lodgepole pine, the air thick with the resinous scent of sap. Birds startled ahead of them, their wings flashing briefly before disappearing into the canopy. They reached mile 6 by mid-morning, the site where Whitmore's remains had been unearthed. Carver paused, letting her eyes sweep the clearing. From here the trail narrowed, snaking deeper into the woods, and the ground sloped steadily toward the sound of running water. Each step seemed to draw them further away from the present and deeper into the shadow of what had happened that summer in 1986. The shack appeared suddenly, half hidden by a curtain of overgrown alder. It leaned to one side, the roof sagging under years of snow and neglect. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Carver approached slowly, pushing it open with the end of her boot. The air inside was stale, the dim light revealing a clutter of rotting boards, an overturned chair, and a rusted lantern still perched on a shelf. Near the far wall, a heap of old canvas was piled over something solid. She knelt, pulling it back to reveal a wooden crate with the lid pried loose. Inside were scraps of clothing, most too degraded to identify, but one piece caught her eye. It was a strip of green fabric with a thin yellow stripe identical to the trim on a ranger's summer uniform from the 80s. The ranger beside her let out a slow breath. "That's Whitmore's." Carver studied the crate, noticing small bones scattered in the bottom animal, likely from trapping, but mixed with them were two human teeth, their enamel dulled with age. She placed them carefully into an evidence bag, her mind already piecing the scene together. This had been more than a hideout. It was a place where Latham worked, stored what he took, and kept things no one was meant to find. Whitmore had walked into this place 18 years ago. Carver stepped back into the sunlight, the creek murmuring nearby, knowing the forest had just given her another piece of the truth and a sharper edge to the questions she would take back to Latham. Back at the station, Carver laid the crate's contents out on brown evidence paper. The strip of uniform cloth was placed beside Whitmore's file, the yellow stripe, a faded echo of the photographs taken before his disappearance. The two teeth, though small, were already with the lab for analysis. If they matched Whitmore, it would mean his death had not occurred exactly where his body was buried. He had been moved. The ranger lingered near the doorway, his arms folded. If he was killed at that shack, why bury him miles away? Carver didn't look up from her notes. Because someone wanted to separate the body from the place. It delays the connection, makes it harder to prove. She kept returning to the Polaroids, spreading them across the table in the same order she'd found them. The girl's expression shifted subtly from one to the next, her eyes moving from guarded to hollow. The last image showed her alone, standing outside the shack, a faint shadow in the background that could have been a second figure. Carver had it enlarged, the grain rising up in the blown-out edges until the shape was more distinct. A man's profile, blurred but unmistakable in outline. She called the lab again. The DNA results on the hair fibers were in. Female, not a match to anyone in the missing persons database so far. That meant whoever she was, she had never been officially reported missing, or her case had been lost in the gaps of the system. By late afternoon, Carver had what she needed to confront Latham again. This time, she would not go in alone. She briefed the deputies, laying out the photographs, the uniform scrap, and the location of the shack. Each piece was another nail in the coffin of his denials. As the sun began to sink behind the ridge, the shadows stretched long across the station floor. Carver stood at the window, looking out at the darkening line of trees. Somewhere out there was the missing half of the story, the moment between Whitmore stepping into that clearing and his body ending up beneath a fire pit. She turned back to the evidence table, her jaw set. The forest had hidden that truth for 18 years. She intended to make Latham speak it out loud. They reached Latham's cabin just after sunrise, frost still clinging to the grass in the clearing. Carver stepped out first, the deputies fanning wide, their boots crunching in the stillness. Latham opened the door before she could knock, leaning on the frame as if he had been expecting them. His expression was unreadable, but there was no surprise in his eyes. Carver held up a photograph of the girl, the one taken outside the shack. "We found this. We also found Whitmore's uniform scrap and two human teeth inside that same building. You want to tell me why?" Latham's gaze drifted past her toward the trees, as if weighing how far he could get before they stopped him. Then he stepped back, gesturing for them to come inside. The air in the cabin was warm, thick with the smell of burning pine. He lowered himself into a chair at the table, the cigarette in his fingers trembling slightly. "She wasn't supposed to be there," he said finally. "Ran away from somewhere east. I didn't ask questions. She was half-starved. I gave her a place to sleep." "And Whitmore?" Carver's voice was steady, but the deputies shifted slightly closer. Latham's jaw worked. He came around asking about traps. Then he saw her. Said he had to take her in, get her somewhere safe. She didn't want to go. She was scared. "Thought the people she ran from would find her," they argued. "I told him to leave her be." He paused, the weight of the next words pulling them down. It got out of hand. Carver leaned in. "You hit him. He grabbed my arm, tried to push past me. I swung. He went down hard. I didn't mean—" His voice trailed off, rough as gravel. "I panicked. Took him to the creek first, then buried him near the trail. Thought I'd keep folks from looking here." "What happened to her?" Carver asked. Latham stared at the floor. "She left. One morning she was gone. Never saw her again." The silence that followed was heavy. The sound of the fire snapping in the stove, the only movement in the room. Carver straightened, signaling to the deputies. Latham did not resist when they moved in. Outside, the frost was already melting under the sun, revealing the damp earth beneath. Latham was led out of the cabin in handcuffs, his head bowed against the cold morning air. Carver watched him step down from the porch, each movement slow and deliberate, as if the weight of the years he had kept this secret had finally settled fully onto his shoulders. The deputies guided him toward the waiting vehicle while she remained at the doorway, her eyes drifting back to the dim interior of the cabin. Inside, the lantern on the table still glowed faintly, casting a pale light across the worn wood. Carver moved through the space one last time, scanning for anything they might have missed. In the corner, a stack of weathered notebooks sat under a layer of dust. She picked one up and flipped through the pages, the handwriting uneven but familiar from the earlier notes in the evidence file. It was a ledger of sorts, recording trap locations, supply lists, and the occasional name. On one page, dated just a week before Whitmore vanished, there was a simple entry, "North Trail, Mile 6, keep her inside." She slipped the notebook into an evidence bag and stepped back out into the clearing. The ranger was waiting by the second vehicle, his breath curling in the cold air. "That line in his book," she said quietly, "it means Whitmore didn't just stumble across her. Latham was keeping her there. He knew she was hiding." The ranger nodded, his jaw tight. "And she's still out there somewhere. Or she was, for a while at least." "How one?" The convoy started down the narrow track, the sound of the engines muffled by the trees. Carver followed, the frost-bright ground giving way to shadowed bends in the road. She thought about the girl, how close she had come to being pulled into the official record only to vanish again. Somewhere, her story was unfinished, and though Latham's confession closed one part of the case, it left another wide open. By the time they reached the station, the sky was turning a hard, pale blue. Latham was escorted inside, his figure swallowed by the doorway. Carver stayed outside for a moment longer, the cold biting at her fingers. Justice for Whitmore was finally within reach, but the forest still held the name and fate of the one witness who could tell the rest. The interview room was small, the kind of space that made silence feel heavier. Latham sat at the table, his hands cuffed in front of him, the cigarette smell still clinging to his clothes. Carver entered without a file, choosing instead to bring only the Polaroids. She set them down one by one, the images spreading across the tabletop until they formed a fractured timeline. Latham's eyes moved over them, his expression shifting just enough for her to see where the truth might still be hiding. She tapped the last photo, the one with the faint shadow of a second figure behind the girl. "Who was this?" "It's not you. You're in the frame. Someone else was there." He leaned back slowly, the chair creaking. "Doesn't matter. He's dead now." "It matters if he's the reason she disappeared," Carver said. "You said she left on her own. I don't think that's true. I think someone came for her, and you let it happen." Latham's gaze drifted toward the corner of the room, his mouth tightening. "You don't understand. She didn't want to go with Whitmore, and she didn't want to stay with me. When he showed up, I thought maybe she'd be safe, but then he stopped, jaw working. That man in the picture? He knew her from before. She looked at him like she'd seen a ghost. She was gone the next day. No note, just gone. Who was he? Latham hesitated, then muttered a name. Carver recognized it instantly from an old arrest report, a drifter with a record for assault and abduction, last seen in the region in the late 80s. The fact that his trail had gone cold not long after fit too neatly to ignore. She gathered the photographs, sliding them back into the envelope. Latham watched her, his expression caught between relief and unease. "If you find her," he said quietly, "don't tell her about me. Let her think I'm still in these woods." Carver paused at the door, meeting his eyes. "She already knows what you are." Outside, the hallway was bright with late morning light. The name he had given her was another path into the forest, and it was one she intended to walk. Whitmore's death was no longer the only mystery she was chasing. Carver spent the afternoon in the archives, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above her as she dug through boxes of old case files. The name Latham had given her surfaced in a stack of yellowed reports from 1984 to 1989. The man had been arrested twice for violent offenses in neighboring states, each time slipping through on technicalities. His last known address was a post office box in a small Montana town not far from the park's eastern border. After 1988, there was nothing. No arrests, no sightings, no trace. She called the town's sheriff, an older man with a voice that carried the weight of too many winters. He remembered the name, remembered the man's habit of camping deep in the timber for weeks at a time. "Kept to himself mostly," the sheriff said. "But there were rumors. Folks said he wasn't alone out there. A young woman, maybe. No one ever proved it." The sheriff's words sharpened the edges of what Carver already suspected. If the girl in the Polaroids had gone with him, willingly or not, it was possible she had been hidden in those woods for years before disappearing entirely. She made a note to pull old aerial surveys and forestry records, looking for any structures or campsites that matched the location in the background of the photos. As evening settled in, Carver stepped outside the station. The air was cooling fast, the horizon washed in shades of copper and violet. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline, the forest kept its quiet hold on the girl's fate. She thought of Whitmore, of the way his patrol routes had led him into danger without hesitation, and of the campers who had unknowingly uncovered the start of all this by lighting a fire in the wrong place. Inside, the evidence board had grown crowded, strings of red thread running between photographs, maps, and reports. Whitmore's face was still at the center, but now the girl's image stood beside his, their stories bound by the same narrow trail in the summer of 1986. Carver knew the next step was to go back out, past the known trails, and into the wild ground where the maps ended. The answers were not in the files anymore. They were waiting in the trees, in the places that had not been touched in decades, and she was ready to follow them there. The trail to the eastern ridge was little more than a memory, swallowed by undergrowth and the slow work of seasons. Carver moved carefully, marking her path as she went, the ranger a few steps behind. The forest here felt older, untouched, the air thick with the scent of damp moss and cedar. They followed the contour of the land until the trees thinned and a narrow valley opened below. From above, it was almost invisible, a dip in the earth where a collapsed roof lay hidden under ferns. As they descended, the shape resolved into the remains of a small cabin, the boards silvered with age. Carver stepped inside, her boots crunching over the remnants of a wood stove and shattered glass. In the far corner, a trunk sat wedged into the earth, half buried by time. It took both of them to haul it free. The hinges groaned as the lid came up, releasing a rush of stale air. Inside were blankets, a rusted tin cup, and a stack of notebooks wrapped in oilcloth. Carver unwrapped the top one, her hands steady, even as her pulse quickened. The handwriting was different from Latham's, but careful, each line dated. The first entries were short, notes about weather and food. Then came longer passages, fragments of a life lived in hiding. She wrote about leaving the shack, about a man who promised safety but carried shadows of his own. The final entry was dated 1991. It ended without ceremony. Heading north, we'll keep moving. I will not be found again. Carver closed the book gently, the weight of it settling in her hands. This was the girl's voice at last, not captured in someone else's photograph, but speaking for herself. She was alive for at least 5 years after Whitmore's death, her fate beyond that still unknown. They packed the trunk for transport, the forest closing in around them as they made their way back. In the fading light, Carver paused, looking out across the ridgeline. Whitmore's story was no longer buried, and the girls had been pulled partway into the open. Some mysteries would remain, held tight by the wilderness, but enough had surfaced to break the silence that had lingered for 18 years. The truth, even incomplete, was finally breathing in the open air.